5 tarnished coins. That was the price of a life, though she thought she was merely saving a dying stray. The blood-soaked burlap sack hid monstrous scars and a terrifying secret. 3 months later, this abused pup wouldn't just slaughter her tormentors, he would bring the werewolf world to its knees. The November rain in Blackwood County, Oregon, didn't just fall, it bit. It sliced through the canopy of the dense pine forests and soaked straight through the threadbare wool coat Andrew Higgins clutched around her frail shoulders. At 20 years old, Andrew carried the heavy, inescapable scent of an omega, a dull, muted aroma of damp earth and crushed cedar that signaled her utter worthlessness to the rest of the Silver Creek pack. In Silver Creek, under the tyrannical rule of Alpha Silas Sterling, omegas were not the cherished peacemakers of ancient werewolf lore. They were slaves. Andrew's days were spent scrubbing the slaughterhouse floors, mending the torn training gear of the enforcers, and subsisting on the meager scraps tossed into the snow by the high-ranking pack members. Her parents had died in a border skirmish when she was just a child, leaving her utterly unprotected. Tonight, however, Andrew had risked a severe flogging to sneak off pack lands. She was navigating the treacherous, mud-slicked paths of the Hollows, a neutral territory where rogues, disgraced witches, and black market traders set up a clandestine supernatural bazaar. She was there for one reason: wolfsbane salve. The pack's beta, a cruel man named Wyatt, had pushed her into a patch of silver thorn bushes the day before, and the deep gouges on her calves were becoming infected. She had exactly 5 tarnished silver coins to her name, hoarded over 4 miserable years. The market was a sensory nightmare. The stench of wet fur, cheap copper, and dark magic hung thick in the fog. Shady figures huddled under canvas tents, whispering deals that traded in blood, stolen artifacts, and illegal enchantments. Andrew kept her head down, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, trying desperately to mask her submissive scent. Useless! Worthless little rat! A harsh, booming voice shattered the low hum of the market. Andrew flinched, instinctively stepping behind a wooden post. A few yards away, an unkempt rogue wolf named Garrett was viciously kicking a rusted iron cage. The cage was small, barely meant for a raccoon, let alone a werewolf. "I'll drown you in the bog myself if I have to look at you one more day," Garrett spat, raising a heavy, steel-toed boot to strike the cage again. Andrew peeked around the post, her breath catching in her throat. Huddled in the corner of the rusted prison was a pup, or at least she assumed it was a pup based on its size. The creature was alarmingly emaciated, its ribs protruding sharply against matted, mud-caked black fur. But the most horrifying detail was its head. A rough, blood-stained burlap sack had been tied securely over the pup's head with a thick piece of twine, choking its neck. The creature was trembling violently, letting out a weak, raspy wheeze with every breath. "Hey, watch it, Garrett," a passing witch sneered. "That thing stinks of death. You're driving away customers." "It's a cursed runt," Garrett growled, spitting into the mud. "Found it near the Obsidian Ridge borders. Thought it might fetch a price from a fighting ringer's bait, but it won't even stand up. Refuses to shift, refuses to eat. The sack stays on because looking at its deformed face makes me sick. I'm tossing it in the river tonight." Andrew's heart hammered against her ribs. Obsidian Ridge. The mere name sent shivers down the spine of any wolf in North America. They were a ruthless, isolationist pack of massive Lykans, rumored to be as close to original, primal monsters as modern shifters could get. But this tiny, broken creature didn't look like a monster. It looked like her, abandoned, abused, deemed worthless. Before her brain could process the immense danger she was putting herself in, Andrew's feet were moving. She stepped out of the shadows, her hands trembling violently. "Woo, wait!" Andrew stammered, her voice barely a whisper over the pouring rain. Garrett turned, his yellow eyes narrowing as he took in her ragged appearance and the weak omega scent wafting off her. He sneered, displaying a row of jagged, yellowing teeth. "What do you want, little omega? Get lost before I decide to sell you too." Andrew stood her ground, though her knees knocked together. She reached into her pocket, her cold fingers wrapping around the 5 hard silver coins. Her salvation, her medicine, the only barrier between her and an agonizing death from silver thorn infection. "I'll buy him," Andrew said, her voice finding a sudden, desperate strength. Garrett blinked, then burst into a harsh, barking laugh. "You? Buy this rotting sack of meat? What are you going to pay with, Omega? Dirt?" Andrew pulled her hand from her pocket and opened her palm. The 5 silver coins glinted dully in the light of the market's oil lanterns. Garrett's laughter stopped abruptly. Silver was a highly valued currency among rogues, pure and untraceable. 5 silver pieces, Garrett muttered, his eyes calculating. He looked at the dying pup, then back at Andrew. "You're insane, girl. It'll be dead by morning. But if you want to waste your life savings on a corpse, be my guest." He snatched the coins from her palm with a greedy swiftness, nearly scratching her skin. With a harsh kick, he sent the small, rusted cage sliding through the mud until it stopped at Andrew's feet. "No refunds, Omega," Garrett sneered, turning his back on her to count his newly acquired wealth. Andrew dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, heedless of the pain shooting up her infected legs. She reached out with trembling fingers, unlatching the rusted door. The pup didn't move. It just lay there, the burlap sack rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. "It's okay," Andrew whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not going to hurt you." She gently reached in and gathered the small, freezing body into her arms. The pup was terrifyingly light, feeling like a bundle of fragile twigs wrapped in wet fur. She tucked him inside her coat, pressing his shivering body against her chest to share whatever little body heat she had left. As she stood and began the long, agonizing trek back to the Silver Creek territory, her leg burned with a fiery agony, protesting the lack of medicine. But as she felt a tiny, weak heartbeat thumping against her own, Andrew knew she couldn't regret her choice. She had bought a life, even if it was just for one night. Andrew lived in what used to be a tool shed on the very edge of the Silver Creek Pack's sprawling estate. The roof leaked, the floorboards were rotted, and the only source of heat was a small, rusted wood-burning stove she had salvaged from a scrapyard. It was a miserable existence, but tonight it was a sanctuary. She kicked the heavy wooden door shut, barring it with a thick plank of wood. The wind howled outside, violently rattling the thin window panes. Andrew collapsed onto her knees beside the stove, gently laying the bundled pup onto a pile of old, relatively dry blankets. Her first priority was the fire. With shaking hands, she managed to strike a match and ignite the meager pile of kindling she had scavenged that morning. As a weak, orange glow filled the drafty shed, Andrew turned her attention back to the pup. He hadn't moved. The burlap sack was completely soaked in rainwater, mud, and dark, dried blood. Andrew's heart ached. The twine tied around his neck was so tight it had cut into his flesh, leaving a ring of matted, bloody fur. "Hold on, little one. Let's get this off you," she murmured softly. She rummaged through her sparse belongings and found a small, dull paring knife. Hands trembling, she carefully wedged the blade beneath the coarse twine, terrified of cutting the pup's throat. With a sharp tug, the twine snapped, Andrew took a deep breath, pinched the top of the burlap sack, and gently pulled it away. She gasped, dropping the sack to the floor as she fell back onto her hands. The face staring back at her was not that of a normal wolf pup. His muzzle was longer, more robust, framed by thick, midnight black fur. But that wasn't what made her recoil. His face was a crisscross of horrific, silver-laced scars. Someone, or something, had tortured him with pure silver blades, leaving jagged, pale lines that would never fully heal. The worst scar started above his left eye and dragged violently down his snout, missing his eye by a fraction of an inch. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed her. As Andrew's sudden movement roused him, the pup's eyelids fluttered open. They were not the standard yellow, brown, or green of an ordinary shifter. They were a piercing, luminescent gold. They glowed in the dim light of the shed with an ancient, predatory intelligence that sent a primal wave of submission crashing over Andrew's omega instincts. For a terrifying second, the shed felt entirely too small. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The pup stared at her, unblinking, and Andrew swore she felt a presence pressing against her mind, a dark, overwhelming dominance that belonged to an alpha of legendary bloodlines. Then, the pup let out a weak, pathetic whine, and the oppressive aura vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His golden eyes dulled, clouded by pain and exhaustion, and his head slumped back onto the blankets. Andrew let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You're just a baby," she whispered, shaking off the irrational fear. "Just a badly hurt baby." Over the next 3 weeks, Andrew's life became a desperate, exhausting balancing act. By day, she endured the grueling labor demanded by Alpha Silas, scrubbing blood from the training mats and dodging the cruel pranks of Beta Wyatt. By night, she became a nurse to the scarred, golden-eyed pup she had tentatively named Barnaby. Barnaby was a voracious eater, a fact that quickly became Andrew's biggest problem. He refused the cheap kibble she managed to steal from the hounds. He only wanted fresh meat. Andrew began risking her life daily, sneaking into the pack's primary meat locker during the guard changes to steal scraps of raw beef and venison meant for the Alpha's table. And then, the impossible began to happen. Normally, a werewolf pup took about a year to reach the size of a standard dog, and several more years to reach full maturity. Barnaby seemed to be mocking the laws of nature. By the end of the first month, he had doubled in size, outgrowing his makeshift bed. By the end of the second month, he was the size of a full-grown timber wolf. His growth was explosive, terrifying, and completely unprecedented. His midnight black fur grew thick and glossy, hiding his emaciated ribs, though the silver scars on his face remained a stark, jagged white. His golden eyes never lost their eerie, intelligent glow. He still hadn't shifted into a human form, which worried Andrew. A pup trapped in its wolf form for too long ran the risk of losing its humanity to the feral beast entirely. But Barnaby wasn't feral. He was shockingly gentle with her. When Andrew returned to the shed, shivering and bruised from the day's torments, Barnaby would be waiting. He would press his massive, warm body against her side, his deep, rumbling, purr-like growl vibrating through her chest, easing the ache in her bones. He was her shadow, her protector, confined to the 4 walls of the rotting shed. But hiding a wolf the size of a bear in a leaky tool shed could only last so long. It happened on a freezing Tuesday evening, exactly 3 months to the day since Andrew had paid 5 silver coins for a dying runt. Andrew had been caught stealing a meager half-pound of raw steak from the kitchens. Beta Wyatt, a towering brute of a man with a penchant for inflicting pain, had caught her by the hair. He dragged her out into the snowy courtyard, drawing a crowd of sneering pack members. "Look what we have here," Wyatt mocked, his voice carrying over the whistling wind. He threw Andrew into the hard-packed snow. She cried out as her knees hit the ice. "The little Omega thinks she can steal from the Alpha's table. What's the matter, Andrew? You tired of eating trash?" "Please, Wyatt," Andrew gasped, spitting blood from where her lip had split. "I'm sorry. I was just so hungry." "Hungry?" A smooth, chilling voice cut through the laughter. Alpha Silas Sterling stepped onto the porch of the main pack house. He was a handsome man, but his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "An Omega who steals from her betters is a liability, Wyatt. Teach her her place. 30 lashes. Then throw her in the isolation cells for a week." Andrew's blood ran cold. 30 lashes from Wyatt's silver-tipped whip would kill her. Even if she survived, a week in the unheated isolation cells in the dead of winter would finish the job. Wyatt grinned, uncoiling the heavy leather whip from his belt. The silver barbs woven into the tip glinted under the moonlight. "With pleasure, Alpha." Andrew curled into a tight ball, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the agonizing bite of the leather. She heard the sharp crack of the whip pulling back through the freezing air. But the blow never landed. Instead, a sound ripped through the courtyard, a sound so primal, so earth-shattering, that the very ground beneath Andrew's knees vibrated. It wasn't a howl. It was a demonic, thunderous roar that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. The shed doors on the edge of the property didn't just open, they exploded outward in a shower of splintered wood and rusted hinges. From the wreckage stepped a nightmare of midnight fur and muscle. Barnaby. But he was no longer just a large wolf. In the 3 hours since Andrew had left him, he had grown again. He stood nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder, a behemoth of rippling black sinew and razor-sharp claws. His golden eyes burned like twin suns in the darkness, locking onto Wyatt with a murderous, unadulterated fury. The silver scars crisscrossing his face made him look like a demon forged in hellfire. The entire courtyard went dead silent. The sneers vanished. Alpha Silas took a sudden, involuntary step backward, the color draining from his face. This was no ordinary wolf. The suffocating, crushing aura of dominance that washed over the courtyard forced half the pack to their knees instantly. It was an alpha's aura, but magnified 100-fold. It was the aura of a Lykan royal. Wyatt, frozen in terror with his whip still raised, let out a pathetic, trembling breath. Barnaby bared teeth the size of hunting knives, the sound of his low growl shaking the snow from the nearby pines. He didn't look at Andrew. His glowing golden eyes were fixed entirely on the man who had dared to strike his mate. The 3 months of hiding were over. The slaughter was about to begin. The courtyard of the Silver Creek pack house was paralyzed by the suffocating weight of a true predator's aura. Snowflakes seemed to freeze mid-air as the colossal, midnight black beast stalked forward. Every step Barnaby took sent tremors through the frozen earth. Beta Wyatt, previously wearing a sadistic grin, now possessed the pallor of a corpse. The silver-tipped whip slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers, landing uselessly in the snow. He took a stumbling step backward, his boots slipping on the ice. "Alpha!" Wyatt choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward Silas Sterling, who stood cemented to the porch stairs. "Alpha, what is that thing?" Silas didn't answer. The haughty, tyrannical Alpha of Silver Creek was too busy trying to force air into his own lungs. The oppressive, golden-eyed stare of the Lykan pinned him to the spot, stripping away decades of arrogant supremacy in a matter of seconds. Barnaby didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate grace. He walked past Andrew, his massive, scarred snout briefly brushing against her frozen cheek. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the murderous intent radiating from his hulking frame. He was positioning himself directly between Andrew and her tormentors, a living, breathing shield of muscle and jagged teeth. With a pathetic cry, Wyatt snapped out of his shock. He lunged for a discarded silver hunting knife left on a nearby barrel. It was a fatal miscalculation. Before Wyatt's fingers could even graze the hilt, Barnaby moved. He didn't just run, he vanished into a blur of black fur. The sound of tearing fabric and snapping bone echoed with sickening clarity over the howling wind. Wyatt screamed, a high, reedy sound that was abruptly cut short as Barnaby's massive jaws clamped down on the baiter's shoulder, lifting the 200-pound man off the ground as if he were a rag doll. With a brutal, vicious shake of his head, Barnaby threw Wyatt across the courtyard. The baiter slammed into the heavy oak doors of the armory, crumpling into a motionless heap in the snow. He wasn't dead, but he wouldn't be walking for a very, very long time. The remaining pack enforcers, witnessing the casual destruction of their strongest fighter, immediately dropped to their knees, baring their throats in absolute, terrifying submission. Barnaby turned his massive, scarred head toward Silas. The Alpha swallowed hard, attempting to project a hollow authority. "Kill it!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am the Alpha of Silver Creek. I command you to kill that beast." Not a single wolf moved. They couldn't. The aura radiating from the black wolf was ancient, primal magic, demanding absolute fealty. Then, the true horror and awe began. Barnaby halted in the center of the courtyard, the air around him rippling with raw energy. Andrew, curled in the snow, stared through tear-filled eyes as the massive wolf began to change. Bones cracked and shifted with a brutal rhythm as the towering beast shrank, its dark fur dissolving under the cold moonlight. The transformation was anything but graceful. It was violent, agonizing, and strangely magnificent. Where the wolf had stood, a man slowly rose from the snow. He was impossibly tall, his powerful frame carved with hardened muscle. Moonlight traced every line of his body as he straightened. Andrew gasped when she saw his face. It was the same one hidden beneath the blood-stained burlap sack earlier. Strong and striking, though scarred by jagged silver burns running across his eye and down his jaw. Yet the scars only made him more formidable. His glowing golden eyes remained unchanged. A whisper of fear rippled through the kneeling wolves. The golden gaze, the obsidian bloodline. The man stepped forward, gaze fixed on Alpha Silas. "You call yourself an Alpha," he said, his deep voice echoing through the courtyard. "Yet you starve your own pack and abuse the woman who saved my life." Silas dropped to his knees. "Who are you?" The man answered coldly. "Dominic Lancaster." The courtyard was dead silent. The undisputed ruler of the most feared Lykan pack in North America stood victorious in the snow. Slowly, Dominic turned around. His terrifyingly harsh features softened the moment his golden eyes locked onto Andrew. He walked toward her, dropping to one knee in the blood-stained snow. Reaching out, he gently wiped a tear from her cheek, his massive thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You paid 5 coins for my life, little bird," Dominic whispered, his raspy voice filled with a reverence she had never heard directed at her. "Now, I give you an empire." The transition of power was instantaneous. Werewolves are creatures of deep instinct, and Dominic Lancaster's dominance was woven into his very DNA. By sunrise, the Silver Creek Pack house had been entirely repurposed. The opulent Alpha suites, once hoarded by Silas, were cleared out, and Andrew found herself sitting on the edge of a massive, plush bed, enveloped in a thick cashmere robe. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, finally driving the bone-deep chill from her body. The door clicked open, and Dominic entered. He was now dressed in a pair of dark, tailored trousers and a heavy linen shirt left unbuttoned at the collar, highlighting the thick muscles of his chest. He carried a silver tray laden with steaming food, roasted meats, fresh bread, and rich, hot broth. He set it gently on the bedside table and pulled up a chair. "Eat," he commanded softly. It wasn't an alpha's order. It was a plea. Andrew picked up a piece of bread, her hand still shaking slightly. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. How did you end up in that cage at the Hollows, with that sack on your head?" Dominic's golden eyes darkened with the memory, the scars on his face pulling tight. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. 6 months ago, my convoy was ambushed near the northern borders of Obsidian Ridge, Dominic explained, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't just rogues. It was a coordinated attack funded by rival packs who feared the Lancaster bloodline. They hired a coven of dark witches. They didn't want to just kill me. They wanted to erase me. He pointed to the jagged scars on his face. They tortured me with pure, liquid silver. When I wouldn't break, the witches bound me. The burlap sack you removed. It wasn't just cloth, Andrew. It was a dark artifact steeped in blood magic. It suppressed my Lykan physiology, shrinking my bones, stealing my strength, and blinding my wolf. It locked me in the body of a dying, pathetic pup. Andrew gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "That's why you were so small. Why you couldn't heal." Dominic nodded grimly. "They gave me to the rogues to sell as bait, a humiliating, slow death for a Lykan king. If the sack had stayed on for another day, my heart would have given out. But then," his golden eyes softened, and he reached out, gently taking Andrew's hand in his large, warm palms. Then, a brave, foolish Omega, with the scent of crushed cedar, walked into the darkest market in the state. You spent your last 5 silver coins on a creature that smelled of death. You didn't just remove the sack, Andrew. Your touch, your pure, unselfish sacrifice, shattered the witch's hex entirely. "But it took 3 months, Andrew reasoned, her brow furrowing. "You stayed in the shed." "The magic was broken, but the silver had poisoned my blood," Dominic explained. "My Lykan biology had to slowly rebuild my bone structure and purge the poison. If I had shifted into my human form too early, the shock would have killed me. I needed time, and I needed an anchor." He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them softly. "You were my anchor, Andrew. You kept me fed, you kept me warm, you kept me sane." Tears welled in Andrew's eyes. For 20 years she had been told she was worthless, a stain on the pack, an Omega meant to serve. Now the most powerful Lykan in the world was kneeling before her, treating her like royalty. "I'm just an Omega, Dominic," she whispered, looking down at her lap. "I don't belong in this room. The pack won't accept me as—" "As what?" Dominic challenged, his voice rising with a fierce, possessive edge. He stood, pacing the length of the room, his imposing presence filling the space. "As their Luna? As my queen? Let them try to object. The old laws of Silver Creek died tonight." He stopped and knelt in front of her again, forcing her to look into his golden eyes. "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, little bird. You are not an Omega because you are weak. You are an Omega because your empathy, your capacity for healing and love, is stronger than any Alpha's bite. You saved me when the greatest warriors of my pack failed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 5 objects. He placed them gently on the pristine white bedsheets. It was the 5 tarnished silver coins. Andrew gasped. How did you? Before I tore down the shed, Dominic smirked, a dangerous, thrilling expression. I tracked down the rogue who sold me to you. Garrett, wasn't it? He won't be visiting the Hollows anymore. I took these back. He picked up one of the coins, turning it over in his massive fingers. I am having these melted down and forged into a ring, a crown for the woman who bought my life. Dominic leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. The scent of rain, pine, and overpowering alpha pheromones wrapped around Andrew, making her heart hammer wildly against her ribs. You are mine, Andrew Higgins, Dominic whispered, his golden eyes glowing with an eternal vow. And I am yours, to the end of my days. For the first time in her 20 years of brutal, agonizing existence, Andrew didn't feel cold. She didn't feel afraid. She wrapped her arms around the Lykan King's thick neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and finally, truly, let herself be home. What began with 5 tarnished coins and a desperate act of mercy transformed the werewolf hierarchy forever. Andrew Higgins, the abused Omega, didn't just save a dying pup. She resurrected the Lykan King. Today, the Silver Creek and Obsidian Ridge packs thrive under their united, compassionate rule. A brutal past birthed a golden era, proving that sometimes the most monstrous disguises hide our greatest salvation.